Okay, so it's about 1 minute after, and I think most everybody's logged in. So we're going to go ahead and start. If everyone could just be sure that they're on mute, that would be helpful. Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Good afternoon. I'm Andrea Weitzel. I'm the Senior Research Program Manager for the Critical Infrastructure Resilience Institute. I'd like to welcome you to the CIRI webinar series. Today's topic is measuring the cost effectiveness of static economic resilience. I'd like to introduce our speakers. Adam Rose is a research professor at the University of Southern California Saul Price School of Public Policy and faculty affiliate of USC's Center of Risk and Economic Analysis of Terrorism Events, or CREATE. Professor Rose's primary research interest is the economics of natural disasters and terrorism. He has spearheaded development of CREATE's comprehensive economic consequence analysis framework to include aspects of mitigation, resilience, behavioral responses, and remediation. He has done pioneering theoretical and empirical research on resilience to disasters at the level of the individual business household, market industry, and regional national economy. Professor Rose is the author of several books and 250 professional papers. He is a fellow of Regional Science Association International and president of the International Society for Integrated Disaster Risk Management. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including the DHS CREATE Transition Product of the Year Award. Noah Dorman
Thank you, Andrew.
of Ohio State works in two main areas, energy and environmental markets, and economic analysis of disasters and disaster resilience. His work on the economic analysis of resilience has focused on the impacts of terrorism events and natural hazards on firms and regional economies. His work provides insights and strategies for businesses and governments to minimize the severity of disasters and hasten recovery thereafter. His work has been funded by a broad array of federal, state, and NGO sources, including the National Science Foundation, the Department of Homeland Security, GE Capital's National Center for the Middle Market, and the John Randolph and Dora Haynes Foundation. His work has been published in a broad array of governmental publications and academic peer-reviewed journals. Why don't you go ahead and take it away, Adam?
Thank you very much for the nice introduction, Andrea. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay. Well, I'm glad to have the opportunity to present this webinar today. I'll be sharing it with Noah Dorman at Ohio State, but we'd also like to acknowledge the contributions made by Heather Rosoff to this project. Heather is a protege of CREATE Director Detloff von Winterfeld, an expert in survey research, which is a key component of our study. So let me get started by mentioning that most studies of the economic consequences of terrorism and natural disasters have focused on property damage. However, there's increasing attention to business interruption, or BI, caused by disasters, which is typically measured in terms of things like gross domestic product or employment losses. The unique thing about business interruption is it begins when the disaster strikes, but extends out to or until a business or entire economy have recovered. Also interesting is that BI has exceeded property damage in recent actual events and simulation. For instance, I had the honor of coordinating 8 studies, including one of my own, to come up with a definitive estimate of the economic consequences of the World Trade Center attacks. And in 2017 dollars, the property damage there would be about $40 billion, but the business interruption impacts were more than 4 times that amount. In terms of Hurricane Katrina, we have property damage of 100 billion, but business interruption, that actually should read 150 billion. The Great Shakeout earthquake simulation of Southern Andreas Fault, catastrophic earthquake, the property damage was estimated at 120 billion, and the business interruption, in this case, was a little less, but still a very substantial 80 billion. Hey, let me ask a favor. Somebody just came on, and there's a lot of background noise, so put your phone on mute, the person who I think just may have come on. So one thing to emphasize, where does resilience fit into all of this? We've talked about business interruption as opposed to property damage. So resilience is a way to reduce business interruption by maintaining business continuity and promoting recovery. In short, we are equating resilience in a more narrow way than is often used by relating it to business continuity and promoting recovery. So one can reduce property damage typically by pre-event mitigation, and you also reduce some business interruption, and that's primarily the purview of engineers. Economists like Noah and I can't do any better than engineers on reducing property damage. On the other hand, where economists play this unique role is in evaluating business continuity and resilience and helping promote business continuity. And that's what we want to emphasize, okay? So let me go back. Somebody's shuffling papers and making a lot of noise. So it may be better if everybody just puts yourself on mute, please. All right. So it's not enough to raise awareness, and Noah or Andrea, it may be one of you two.
I'm on mute, Adam.
All right, all right.
I've been trying to mute people as they join.
Yeah, it's not enough to raise awareness about resilience. What you want to do is be able to implement it in an efficient manner so we're not wasting money. And so the intent of our work is to help businesses manage resilience for both their own survival, but also the region's economy. So it doesn't do you much good if you've got your business back on your feet, but other businesses are still trying to recover and the regional economy is imploding. People are going to leave. You're not going to have a demand for your product if it's primarily a local product. So the intent is to estimate the cost effectiveness of economic resilience tactics and ultimately to develop a business resilience calculator to identify and gauge progress on resilience. So it turns out we've done a study, and we've done studies in conjunction with a group at Illinois I'll talk about in a while. It turns out there are millions of businesses that are really operating without adequate information about actions to cost effectively respond to disasters after they strike. And again, that's where resilience comes in. These are primarily smaller businesses. Larger businesses have their own resilience expert and resilience team, but small businesses don't, and that's who we're really trying to help, small and middle-sized businesses. And it turns out in looking at the situation, no one really has attempted to develop a rigorous, evidence-based and tractable metric for assessing the cost effectiveness of disaster responses, and that's what we've done. So our overall objective then is to derive and apply a rigorous analytical framework to estimate the cost effectiveness of economic resilience tactics, and we've been able to accomplish many things. We've developed a rigorous theoretical framework using applied microeconomics that's being published in the International Journal of Production Economics, which is widely published in by people, economists, operations research people, decision analysts who are working on economic impacts and resilience, primarily a focus on the supply chain, and our work fills an important niche of looking at individual firms in relation to direct suppliers, not the entirety of the supply chain, but there is that niche and void that we filled in there. We've also collected primary data through a survey of Superstorm Sandy victims, and we're about to pull the trigger on one for Hurricane Harvey victims in Texas. We've calculated cost effectiveness ratios for a dozen resilience tactics, performed statistical analysis so that we've got some idea of the goodness of FID and how reliable these numbers are. We've performed a number of case studies relating to the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, Port Arthur, Port Beaumont, Boston Transportation System, and more recently something called a haywired earthquake scenario for the U.S. Geological Survey. This was a disaster scenario in which the focus was on a major earthquake on the Hayward Fault in East Bay of San Francisco Bay, but its linkage to Silicon Valley, the electricity grid, and the cyber networks and cyberspace. And finally, we are in the process of exploring the creation of the development of a business resilience calculator as a software tool for businesses. So let me define resilience as we're using it in our study. So we all know there are now dozens of definitions of resilience. It's become a big buzzword. And I've studied resilience in a dozen fields: operations research, psychology, sociology, economics, planning, engineering. And I've really found more commonalities and differences. So what I've got here is kind of a general definition which captures the essence of the concept. And the first one is due to hauling, buzz hauling, the ability of a system to maintain function when shocked. Well, the economic counterpart of that is the efficient use of remaining resources at a given point in time to maintain production. So economics is all about the science of scarcity, and we don't want to just maintain function. We want to do this with utilizing resources as wisely as we can. And that's the focus of the resilience topic that we're talking about today: how to use those remaining resources, the factory that you have, the capacity you have intact. Dynamic resilience in general refers to the ability and speed of a system to recover. This is more the PIM definition of resilience. And in economics, this relates to the efficient use of resources over time for investment in repair and reconstruction, including expediting that process. So that's kind of a separate set of research. We recently had a National Science Foundation grant to make some headway on that, and we did so primarily on a theoretical and case study plane. We're still hoping to do a survey to get some numbers there. But the bottom line here is that our definition of resilience is a little more narrow. There's a perfectly good word for what you do before a disaster to reduce losses, and that's mitigation. We'd like to confine the word resilience to what you do afterwards to reduce business interruption. And that's, consistent, but only part of the usual standard definition. But when we say things that businesses do after the disaster strikes, we keep in mind that we do admit that resilience is a process, and you can build resilience capacity ahead of time by pre-positioning assets, such as building up stockpiles or ordering and having ready a portable electricity generator. The thing is that you don't really kickstart those or put them into play until the disaster has in fact started. Let me go into the resilience tactics that we're analyzing, and then I'll ask for some clarifying questions. So what I've got listed here are about a dozen static economic resilience tactics. And I might also mention one of the unique things about our study and our focus is an emphasis on more on the customer side. So a lot of studies, if you're talking about critical infrastructure and electric utility or even manufacturing, the electric utility types of resilience would be things like having a redundant system, a parallel system that you could kick in, very expensive. Here our focus is more on how customers cope with the loss of electricity. So they can conserve, they can isolate part of their business from the need for water or power, for instance. They can substitute by using a backup generator. You can't store electricity necessarily, but you can store water, can use excess capacity in your business, relocate, etc. I recall a webinar we gave a while ago. Somebody said, well, are these tactics the tactics that are out there in the literature, or did you guys come up with new names and all? Those of you familiar with HAZUS, which is FEMA's loss estimation tool, will recognize some of these. Resource isolation is referred to as resource importance in HAZUS. In the direct economic loss module, production recapture is in the direct economic loss module. How to make up lost production by working overtime or extra shifts, relocating your activity. Those three are in the direct one. In the indirect economic loss module, you have inventories, import substitution, and excess capacity in there. So these are out there in the literature, sometimes with slightly different names, and what we've done is given them more precision and emphasize the estimation of their cost effectiveness in actual business applications. So let me also mention our business metric. Well, actually, I said I would take some questions. So any clarifying questions out there? And thank you very much for putting yourself on mute. It was pretty tough the first couple of slides with one of you. But any questions on what I've talked about thus far?
I've taken everyone off mute.
Take yourself off mute.
I've taken everyone off mute for
Okay.
a minute.
All right. Thanks, Andrea. Okay. Well, feel free to interrupt me then in the next couple of slides if you have some questions. One of the things we also came up with in prior research, actually, was a metric for resilience. And let me use an example of resilience applied to the 9/11 World Trade Center attacks. So there are 1,100 businesses and government agencies in operation in the Trade Center complex and surrounding buildings before the attacks. 95% of them were able to relocate. Right? If all of the firms would have gone out of business, direct business interruption would have been $58.4 billion. On the other hand, if all relocation were immediate, then there would have been no business interruption. But it took most firms 2 to 6 months to relocate, and there was a loss in business interruption of about $16 billion. So our metric, operational metric for measuring resilience, is the avoided losses or prevented losses divided by the maximum potential losses. And so that's 58.4 minus 16.1, which is the 42.3, divided by the maximum potential, and our metric 72%. In other words, business relocation following the World Trade Center attacks as a resilience tactic were able to prevent 72% of the potential losses, business interruption losses. And we can apply these to all the tactics, and because it's a percentage unit measure, we can readily compare them. We can compare these across states, across industries, using that percentage metric. As far as the theoretical foundation of our work, it really stems from the notion of a production function in economics, where output is a function of various factors of production, including primarily focused on capital labor, but we include natural resources, materials, intermediate goods, because, you know, if you're going to talk about manufacturing and utilities as being critical infrastructure, you need to talk about the potential shortage of those, and those are intermediate goods. They're not capital or labor, or they're infrastructure. So we've got inventories of spatial dimension, management factors, behavioral factors. To the right is a presentation of what we call a constant elasticity of substitution production function that we work with, which is kind of a state-of-the-art depiction and characterization of this concept of a production function. And this was the basis of our theoretical work, and it's also a sound theoretical basis for hypotheses and the derivation of our resilience tactics. So the bottom line is disasters constrain some of these various inputs, and what you want to do is derive an optimal response mix, and that's where resilience comes in. Resilience is a way of making do when you've got a shortage of any of these, and relocating, substituting, etc. And our theoretical analysis examines some key trade-offs in all of those. So let's turn this over to Noah, if we can. I don't know if you've got a little icon up top, whether I need to hit anything, Andrea, or you do to get this over to Noah. Looks like you've taken over.
I tried to give it to him, but it didn't seem to work. Adam, you might have to do it.
Okay, so I'm going to try.
Oh, wait.
So
there we go. We got it.
Okay, Noah Dorman is the new presenter, so that's cool. So you might just put it on slideshow and move forward a couple, and you'll.
How's that?
Yeah, that's good, but you're a slide. You need to go 2 more.
Great.
There you go.
Okay, well, thank you, Adam. So I'm going to dig a little bit more deeply into the weeds here in terms of what we actually did to measure cost effectiveness of each of these static resilience tactics and present some results from our survey-based approach. The first thing that we did was we developed a survey sampling pool, and we really needed to first do this, and I'm going to express what we did in New York and New Jersey with Superstorm Sandy at first. And so what we did there is we developed, using GIS and satellite imaging techniques, we partnered with the firm ImageCat out of Long Beach to develop high-resolution, 3-meter resolution aerial imagery of the area, of the inundation area post-disaster. And we combined that with tax assessment records from New Jersey by county and FEMA's damage estimate data to provide an inundation record for essentially at the street address level for all firms in New York and New Jersey that would be affected, or in neighboring counties or neighboring areas that would be affected by Superstorm Sandy, either directly through water, through inundation, or indirectly through business interruption. And then once we did that, once we developed that survey sampling area, we were able to partner with a professional survey firm, a really excellent firm that I've worked with before in some of my GE Capital funded research, RTI Research, and who took over the role of programming and executing that survey pool directly. So presenting on some of our results, we had a final survey pool of 111 firms, predominantly responses from CEOs or CFOs of firms affected either directly or indirectly through business interruption by Superstorm Sandy. We administered the survey at exactly 60 months following Superstorm Sandy. And the majority of the firms recovered in less than 2 years. And so what I'm showing you there on the left is really kind of a bar chart, a histogram of the recovery duration of firms affected by Superstorm Sandy. A non-trivial portion of the firms report not yet being fully recovered. And the way we in the study measured recovery was a function of their recovery of sales revenue. So if they report not having returned to previous pre-Superstorm Sandy levels of sales revenue, then they would be identified as not recovered. 67.5%, about 2/3 of the firms report having some form of property damage. And on average, the average firm had the average property damage of firms was about $1.4 million. That incorporates some of the larger firms in the New York area. What I'm showing you now is a summary of firms that are in our firm sample to kind of give you a sense that we did a really good job, due diligence of making sure that we had a representative sample of firms by age, by industrial sector, and by firm size in terms of the number of employees, and also by gross sales revenues. And so we had a really nice distribution. I want to highlight the fact, though, if you look in the middle of that table, most of the industrial sectors or the manufacturing sectors or any of the sectors in our survey sample, most of them report fewer employees following Superstorm Sandy in the months immediately following. And so one of the main results from our study is that most of the business interruption was due to an inability to, essentially due to a shortage of employees who could access their workplace, or who were, essentially rerouted to taking care of their homes and their families in the aftermath of the disaster. And what I'm showing you at the bottom there, in the bottom of that slide, what that really shows is that, most of the firms in our survey sample we did a pretty good job in partnering with RTI Research, our survey firm, to make sure that most of our survey sample was firms that were actually located within the inundation zone, within the area that was directly affected by Superstorm Sandy. What I'm showing you now is a table that shows you a little bit about what these firms went through in terms of damage and disruption. The average firm observed reported about just under $1 million of property damage, but that's because that incorporates some of those larger firms. When we compare that to the median firm, accounting for many of the smaller businesses in our sample, the median firm reported about $15,000 in property damage. And the median firm reported about $100,000 in business interruption in terms of sales revenues that were not recovered. What's also interesting here is that we asked firms a really interesting question. We asked them to tell us what their actual duration of recovery was. And what you'll see is, for the most part, some firms, a large chunk of firms, reported actually recovering to greater levels than before Superstorm Sandy, and some simply at the 60-month mark report not being recovered any more than they were prior to Superstorm Sandy. So from a research standpoint, those firms that exceeded pre-Sandy levels in terms of sales revenue are also really insightful for us to study, because we really want to know what they did right after the disaster to recover in such a short period of time to exceed pre-disaster levels of sales revenues. What I'm showing you now is really kind of a summary of what happened to those firms in terms of how they were disrupted. What types of disruptions did they observe in terms of critical infrastructure or in terms of constraints on their labor pool? And what you'll see there is that the majority of firms in our sample reported labor pool disruptions, employees that either moved away or were unable to travel to work, as a major portion of a major contributing factor to their disruption. Another major contributing factor was communications disruptions, inability to access telephone and internet communications. Power outages were a major source of disruption, and 72% of firms reported transportation disruptions, either a roadway or some form of critical transportation infrastructure being disrupted. But what we also studied was not just whether they reported that disruption, but whether or not they reported business interruption as a function of that disruption. And what's really interesting is that if you look at the two labor-related disruption types or the power outage disruption types, 26% of our total business interruption was due to power outages, and 20% was due to employees unable to travel to work. And so it really kind of highlights the importance of critical infrastructure, particularly electric infrastructure, from a customer standpoint in terms of minimizing disruptions, in terms of the impacts of those types of critical infrastructure disruptions. What I'm showing you now is losses that firms reported, losses in sales revenue and business interruption, as measured by business interruption, by the actual source of disruption. And what we do in the papers that we're writing as a result of stemming from this work, we're reporting mostly in terms of median values And I think that's appropriate because we have a really good survey pool of firms, both smaller size firms and large firms, and medians really help us report kind of a more representative metric than the average, given the shift in the average associated with the larger firms. And one of the things that I mentioned before in terms of employees and employees unable to travel to work or employees moving away, firms reported that the median business interruption associated with employees moving away was about $90,000. And so that's a lot of money in terms of their duration of their recovery over if it was a 2-year recovery period or a 1-year recovery period. The median firm that had employees moved away as a source of business interruption reported that about $225,000 associated with that disruption, and that's a median figure. And so really, I think it's really interesting. I think it really highlights the importance of making sure that employees can return to their places of work, because in addition to the importance of critical infrastructure disruptions, making sure that employees are able to access that point, to access the businesses to function is critically important. So in terms of getting to cost effectiveness, I've provided some descriptives in terms of types of disruptions and the types of firms in our sample. At the end of the day, what we really wanted to develop and what was really critical for measuring the cost effectiveness of each of those resilience tactics was to develop what's called a cost curve. And a cost curve is a way of mapping the metric that Adam just went through a few moments ago in terms of avoided losses as a function of costs. And what that tells us essentially, and that allows us to do, is that allows us to show which of the resilience tactics, which of those tactics are most cost effective and which ones are least cost effective. And I think that's really helpful for a firm if you think about from the standpoint of a firm trying to figure out in a scramble after a disaster, not knowing which particular sets of actions or tactics that they can put in place that will give them the most bang for their buck. And a cost curve really helps us to learn from prior firms' experiences, in this case with Superstorm Sandy, which of those tactics are most cost effective, which of those tactics give them the greatest avoided losses as a function of how much money they had to put in to implement those tactics. In our sample, firms avoided $142 million in total sales revenue losses by using the total approximately a dozen tactics. $43 million was spent on cost incurring tactics. Some tactics, $35 million worth, were cost savings tactics. In other words, they implemented them and they saved money in the process. On net, taking the simple sum of those two, on net, firms spent $7.6 million in our sample. The total average cost effectiveness gives us a ratio of 18 to 1, actually 18.7 to 1. So that tells us that the average tactic after Superstorm Sandy, in the aftermath of Sandy, the average tactic returned to firms $18 in avoided losses for every dollar spent on resilience. And I want to pause and just think about the magnitude of that number for a second. A lot of the policy recommendations for building resilience, especially in mid-sized businesses, is to insure. Put your money into Wall Street. And, will you ever see that type of return from insurance? Are you ever going to see an 18 to 1 figure? I think these are powerful metrics on the potential for firms to recover and to avoid business interruption by investing in their own plant and equipment. 18 to 1. It's a pretty astounding figure. What I'm showing you now is the cost effectiveness by each individual tactic. And what you'll see there is that a lot of those tactics, I think I'm showing you both by average and median. And the first three columns there are providing the actual cost of implementing a tactic, what the firm reported that they spent or saved for cost savings tactics on implementing the tactic. And the next three columns are providing the effectiveness in terms of avoided losses associated with those tactics. If you divide the total effectiveness by the total cost, that gives you what's called an effectiveness ratio, or the cost effectiveness of that tactic. And so if you look at, say, resource isolation, and resource isolation, as Adam mentioned a few minutes ago, is essentially modifying a portion of your business to run without a critical input. Resource isolation gave these firms approximately $11.84 of avoided losses for every dollar they spent on resource isolation. Some tactics report negative numbers in terms of they're actually cost savings. So technological change gave firms for every dollar they saved on a tactic, they got $7.53 back in avoided losses. The big outlier in our study was relocation. And as Adam mentioned from the 9/11 study, relocation was critically important. It remains a critically important tactic here. And what we believe is going on in the data, we're getting a 432 to 1 number for relocation. What's really going on there is we've got firms in Long Island, firms in southern Manhattan, and firms in the Hoboken area that relocated when their physical property was inundated, relocated inland to a less expensive lease, and so they observed a great deal of savings associated with that relocation. But on average, these numbers, aside from relocation, are pretty striking: 7 to 1, 8 to 1, 20 to 1, etc. And I think being able to measure the cost effectiveness of each of these resilience tactics, I think is a really important contribution, and I think it's also a really important metric for firms to be able to use for planning purposes. In our study, the average firm avoided $3.24 for every dollar that they spent on tactics. And the 18 to 1 number is the economy-wide average. What I'm giving you now is the firm-wide average, the average for each firm. So the average firm avoided $3.24 for each dollar they spent on tactics. And if we separate out cost incurring and cost savings tactics on net, for those firms that observed net costs of implementing tactics, for every dollar they spent, they avoided $3.59. And for firms observing net savings of implementing those tactics, for every dollar they saved, they avoided $2.84. And I want to put that into perspective in terms of the opportunity here for gains in terms of resilience and cost effectiveness. On average, if the economy-wide average was 18 to 1 and the firm-level actual observed average was between $3 and $4 to 1, there's a lot of room for improvement. And so I think the role of our public policymakers, decision makers, and indeed the Critical Infrastructure Resilience Institute in terms of promulgating research like this could make quite a significant contribution in terms of informing business practices because we can go from what they observed is about 3 to 1 to 18 to 1 is the potential. Adam, I'll turn that back over to you.
Okay. Thank you.
Andrea, can you do that for me? There we go.
Okay. I think I don't have to hit the share, but can. Oh. Okay. So let's see. Screen. Share. Let's see if that does it. I think I'm okay now. I don't want to stop. Share your screen. Share my screen. Oh.
We can see your screen, Adam.
Yeah, Andrea, it's jammed a little. So let me make a suggestion. And the first one is, are there any questions? And Andrea, let's try for a minute. Otherwise, I may have to have you just, or Noah, move my slides. I just second page down. Yeah, it's not doing it. I don't want. So any questions out there? Andrea, you may need to take them off mute.
Oh, they are off mute.
So any questions? Well, we must be doing a bang-up job, Noah. Or is it, we've got people who are having difficulty with the economics. But in any case, why don't we go ahead to slide, Andrea, slide 18.
Okay.
It's customers, put it on slideshow, and I'll just say next slide. Almost there. Next one over to the right. No. Oh, no. Right there. That's it. Hit that, and we'll get the full thing showing. So these are just some customers that we've engaged with that are varied. LADWP, Center for the Middle Market, which deals with middle-sized firms in all industries. Business Executives for National Security, where I'm working on a study on the effects of soft target countermeasures on business performance in terms of people's willingness to actually, frequent these facilities, and also the Los Angeles Emergency Preparedness Foundation. So let's go to the next slide. Andrea, can you help me? Next slide.
I'm trying. Just a sec.
Now viewing and okay. Oh. Okay. Yeah, you may just be able to hit page up, page down, or one of the arrows. So what I'd like to talk about now to kind of close things out is we've developed an operational metric, we've collected data. Now we want to talk about building a decision support tool, right? And essentially what we are going to do in the process of doing is using our survey results to build a tool that can compile a resilience index for a typical business. And this would be not just the effectiveness that I talked about in terms of the metric, but into the areas that Noah got into with cost effectiveness. And the combination enables us to specify a resilience index with appropriate weights. If you look at resilience indices out there, most of them use the cop-out and say, well, we're going to give all the individual components equal weights. Well, essentially, the effectiveness of the various tactics can serve as the appropriate weight. So another contribution is when we've been able to overcome this problem. The results that we have can serve as a checklist for individual businesses on resilience tactics. In other words, segmenting this by industry, we can show a firm in a given industry what resilience tactics other businesses have used and found effective in case they haven't thought of them. Some numbers, if they haven't come up with any resilience measures of their own, our numbers can serve as a default for them, default values or best practice values until they can do a self-assessment. And then the calculator is also intended to enable firms or help firms set targets for resilience. So businesses can use the resilience calculator to gauge their progress. They can use guidelines from the survey and case studies for self-improvement. It also may be helpful to government in helping out where government can capitalize on the self-motivation of businesses. I mean, for a good major part of business resilience, we don't have to tell firms how to survive. They kind of know how to survive. We're supplementing their abilities by pointing out additional tactics and by helping them put together the most cost-efficient mix of tactics. So all of the analysis will help government also realize which tactics firms normally use and which they need help on so they can get out of the way. Government can get out of the way, let businesses do what it can do well, and then get involved where there's a need for government involvement, providing subsidies to help promote some of these worthwhile resilience tactics, or implementing deregulation in some cases where it would help businesses get back on their feet. Next slide. Okay, thank you, Andrea. So this slide has a different template because this is, we're working with a group at the encouragement of David Nickel and Randy Sandone to determine whether our business resilience calculator really has some market appeal. And we're working with a group of graduate students at the University of Illinois that, remind me, Andrea, what does IBC or NOAA IBC stand for?
Illinois Business Consulting.
Illinois Business Consulting, all right. And they are very sharp, and essentially what they've done is a marketing analysis for us to see if our school would potentially have a market, and to help us design it so that it is more user-friendly and appropriate. So we've helped them in understanding resilience. The normal definitions, it typically says resist, absorb, and adapt, and we've put in the word recover to place that emphasis. We've provided an introduction to them and a better understanding, so they know that what we're looking to do is a decision support software system that's going to be based on this solid research, evidence-based work of the surveys, and a focus on the cost effectiveness of individual resilience tactics. And the functionality of this is to evaluate an inventory of tactics to reduce losses, fill in the gaps in the user data with the default values from prior research, provide a resilience score for businesses so they can gauge where they stand, and help them improve their standing. And some things we're going over with the team is whether this should be cloud-based or have other types of platforms for potential use. So the next slide, Andrea. Next slide is just a mock-up of the user interface of what this would look like. The user would decide whether they just simply wanted to use general information available or to input some secure information, whether their resilience score that they wanted printed out was for current resilience or a future target, whether they wanted to explore resilience tactics for one product at a time or all of them, whether they wanted to consider various categories of improvement strategies within their business, across businesses, also in relation to deregulations or government subsidy. And essentially, one would simply just click on that green either or both general or secure data, and that's sort of like the go button. And the next slide is an example of what would pop up for them. These are the resilience scores for 2018, which would compare the score of the individual business for our tactics with the sector average for all the products. Product 2, for instance, it's impossible to isolate part of your business from that product input, whether it's a semiconductor or whether it's water. So it's NA, but otherwise you can see for this hypothetical business, it's actually doing pretty well in relation to the sector average with some of the scores I mentioned, but overall, actually that bottom recapture is not an overall number, it's just the recapture number. In product 2, it's doing not quite as well, and product 3, it's doing pretty well as also. But many businesses are going to have the screen show up and show that they're doing underperforming, and that's where there really will be some impetus. And even if business is kind of overperforming, there's still the opportunity to improve and learn from other businesses. Next slide. So some of the research implications, just the last 2 slides. No, let's go back. That's the last slide. This research implications. So there are many cost-effective post-disaster resilience tactics. Customers have, less costly and more costly options, and we've established this primary data set and done analyses that would help them evaluate their alternatives. It also helped inform businesses about best practices, and we hope to provide businesses with this practical software tool to guide their progress, and also help government identify ways to avoid undercutting business motivations, and ways to support resilience. So the last slide, Andrew. Okay. So as far as the impact, we're providing businesses with this inventory of resilience tactics to help reduce future losses and the costs of reducing those losses. Provide businesses with estimates of the cost and effectiveness of each tactic. The businesses, a BRC, Business Resilience Calculator, will help businesses gauge the current status of resilience and help them improve it. We hope that our research will be of use not only to businesses, but also various DHS offices and components listed there. And finally, we hope that other government agencies at the state and local level or internationally will be interested in using our research in general and our practical business resilience calculator. So thank you. Andrea, do you want to take me off mute? And, any questions? So I see a question. It says, has the work, oh, it disappeared.
Oh.
So there's a question from Amy Schwab that disappeared on my screen. Amy, do you want to repeat?
I can read it here. It says, has the work been related to any PNC insurance folks? Since a reduction in BI losses relates directly to their losses, I'm wondering if implementation of these strategies could be related to lower BI insurance costs.
Right. Well, two things about that is business interruption is still kind of underutilized, business interruption insurance, an underutilized tool. And I can refer you to a paper I wrote with Charlie Hike that's in a 2017 issue of Risk Analysis, which will give you a good intro if you're not familiar with it. And the answer is yes, there's the potential. And I might say I've been slow in getting into the insurance area, and I'm just now doing this with insurance savings from something called the PACE program, that helps finance mitigation as opposed to resilience. But and we're looking at the reductions in insurance premiums that's brought about. And state regulators actually have helped promote that in the behalf of customers. When customers have undertaken various kinds of mitigation, especially in Florida and California, earthquake and hurricane respectively, there have been insurance savings. And that's one of the next things we need to do is start talking to insurance companies about how this can serve a related purpose in helping them determine how much the premiums might be lowered. Excellent question. Thank you for asking that.
Amy says, thank you.
Okay, that came up. I don't know why the other thing disappeared after a few minutes. So we've got about 6 more minutes, and I'm wondering if there are any other questions. Don't be shy. You don't have to give your name. I guess if you speak in the phone, you can be anonymous. Not the anonymous these days, but you can be anonymous.
Hi, this is Caitlin Murphy. I have a question.
All right.
I'm just curious about if you capture any correlation between this relocation that you're finding to be fairly cost effective and the impact that would have on the underlying community. I assume some of the businesses would actually be impacted by other businesses relocating to a different area. So I'm just curious if that's captured or beyond the scope.
Okay. Well, let me just give a short answer and then turn it over to Noah. So one thing to keep in mind about relocation is whether it's temporary or permanent. So the temporary relocation is probably going to generally be more good than bad, even though it's going to hurt the local economy a bit, but it may help the business survive so it can come back. But permanent relocation is problematic, and that probably needs to be evaluated not just in the context of the individual business survival, but the community's survival, or my thoughts. Noah, do you have anything you want to add from Just general perspective and the numbers that you've been working with?
Yeah, so most of the firms in our New York and New Jersey sample leased their facilities. The larger firms did not, but most of the firms leased, and they were obviously more nimble in their ability to relocate to another, leased location if they were a, commercial outfit. And so for them, I think, the impact in terms of correlations on the local economy there, I think, they didn't have any search frictions, as it were, in the same way that firms that own their businesses would. But that being said, the cost differential from like Manhattan real estate to inland New Jersey real estate was so huge. I think that's really what's driving that number there.
Okay.
Did that answer your question, or?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's probably the temporary part was what I hadn't really considered. I was thinking this was sort of a permanent relocation of businesses and what that would mean for other people who are maybe relying on those businesses tangentially. Right.
We've got a question on here from Matt Miller. Matt asks, were there any standards that you considered in your research related to business continuity and or resilience? Adam, you want to take that one?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, and I have to say we didn't, but we'd like to. So Matt, if you've got some references to standards, the irony is there are now some standards on dynamic economic resilience, which is repair and reconstruction. So if you're familiar with the SPUR initiatives that started in San Francisco, these provide target dates for repair and reconstructing homes and commercial facilities and public buildings so as to get the economy back on its feet faster to avoid permanent out-migration. And those are excellent, well-developed. That's really taking off, but it's primarily a public initiative. I would think there might be some business organizations or individual firms or some researchers come up with some static resilience targets. So Matt, can you refer us to any examples?
Adam, before he does that, I just want to mention as well, we did a review with our IBC team of the ISO standard for business continuity. And, the definitions that they use in their policy guidance through the ISO standards for business continuity, though they're a few years old now, are almost identical to the definitions that we've used in our survey. And so as we work to develop our survey, as we work to develop our resilience calculator software, we're working very diligently to make sure that we are able to be ISO standardized.
Okay. So Noah, by ISO, are we talking about electricity independent system operators, or is ISO stands for something else? What does ISO stand for in this case?
This is industry standards.
Oh, okay. So, I guess it's one of the cases where we haven't connected on an important aspect that we should and that I've overlooked. So thanks for mentioning that, and let's follow up on that.
Sure.
It's pretty important.
Matt, did that answer your question, or do you anything else you'd like?
Yeah, we got
a
perfect and thank you from Matt.
Oh, good. I don't see that. Great.
Well, since we're at the top of the hour, we should probably sign off. I just want to thank you guys.
Okay. Well, we want to thank you for organizing this and being patient with us about our schedule and getting us set up so effectively. And we really thank the audience for being good listeners and for some very astute questions. And, we're easy enough to get a hold of by email. So send us questions, send us suggestions, request papers. We're interested in in broadening our network and working with more people interested in this topic. Noah, do you want to have the final word?
I just want to thank you all for your interest in this work. And if you do have any insights or, would like to point us in any specific directions, papers, please send them to me. I'm very welcoming to input.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.